Hey guys, tonight we are going to uncover the most chilling secrets of Emperor Tiberius, the ruler who wielded both power and perversion to transform the island of Capri into a repository of sexual atrocities unlike anything history has ever witnessed. From children trained as minnows to swim between his legs to grotesque chains, ceremonies, Tiberius's actions seared themselves into the minds of every Roman, forcing them to confront the harsh reality that nothing shatters the illusion of peace like the abuse of authority and the twisted ingenuity of illicit desire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you live? Let me know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. First, set aside all your worries. Take a deep breath and let your mind drift along these gentle words. Tonight, we will close our eyes and imagine a truly remarkable historical figure, Tiberius Caesar, Augustus. He was the second son of Livia Drusilla and Tiberius Claudius Nero, a noble family of the famed Claudius lineage. By blood, Tiberius carried both lines of power from his mother Livia, the granddaughter of Emperor Julius Caesar, and from his father Tiberius Claudius Nero, a respected statesman. Tiberius was born and raised alongside his half-brother Drusus the Younger. His brother was hailed as a rising star in Rome's military ranks, youthful, valiant, and full of promise. In Livia's eyes, Drusus embodied the hope of expanding the empire's frontiers. Standing beside him, young Tiberius felt a complex mix of pride and envy. His childhood was spent in military drills, equestrian exercices, and studying the art of governance. Under his mother's guidance, one of Rome's most intelligent and decisive women. At an early age, Tiberius was married to Vipsania in a political alliance arranged by his family. That marriage, however, was short-lived under the pressures of power and diplomacy. Less than 2 years later, he was forced to divorce Vipsania and wed Julia Augustus's daughter by the direct command of Augustus himself. This union with Julia drew him deeper into the ruthless network of imperial politics, and he tasted bitterness instead of love, treated as a pawn on the imperial chessboard rather than a husband. In 14 Anno Domini, Augustus, his adoptive father, and the first heir to Julius Caesar's seat, officially declared Tiberius as his successor. By then, Tiberius was in his 40s, bearing the emotional scars of devastating loss, the tragic death of Drusus the Younger at only 26 years old. Amid poisoning rumors, left an unhealing wound. The dire news reached him while he was on campaign in northern Germania. Reports from Rome arrived like a nightmare. His admired brother had perished, leaving the burdens of the family and state upon Tiberius's shoulders. On the day he assumed the throne, Tiberius was hailed as the symbol of stability, destined to continue Augustus's policies of limited warfare, fiscal prudence, and respect for the Senate values carefully cultivated by his predecessor under the dim torchlight of the imperial palace. Accompanied by the distant notes of flutes and drums, he swore an oath to maintain peace, protect the borders, and remain faithful to his promises of moderation. Romans, long accustomed to harsh and arrogant rulers, applauded eagerly, hopeful for a new era. During his first decade of reign, Tiberius honored his vows. The imperial treasury was spared extravagant feasts. The army did not embark on distant conquests. The Senate was afforded genuine influence in decision-making. He made notable contributions, fortifying the frontiers to hold back the Germanic tribes across the Rhine, reforming the tax system to lighten the burden on the poor, and upholding a strong central government balanced by aristocratic prestige. Yet beneath that composed exterior, Tiberius's private grief deepened. The loss of Drusus became an ever-deepening scar on his heart. He attended council sessions infrequently, preferring to read reports sealed by the emperor's signet and countersigned by the Senate. Whenever he appeared, his gaze was distant, and his tone sorrowful. Palace informants recalled occasions when he managed a forced smile before the court, a faint glimmer of light in a sea of darkness. His family life was no longer peaceful. His marriage to Julia ended in scandal when Augustus exiled her for licentiousness and deceit. Tiberius lost his first political wife, and any offspring, if they existed, were never mentioned in the annals. The solitude of the imperial household only intensified his unease. Even Livia, his powerful mother, watched her son withdraw from the court under the pretense of retirement, allowing him respite to heal his emotional wounds. Finally, when his son Drusus, the only direct heir, died mysteriously in 23 Anno Domini, rumours of poisoning spread. Though no definitive proof surfaced, suspicion and fear drove Tiberius further into seclusion. He ceased public audiences and rarely attended ceremonies. Instead, he ruled by private letters, sending cold, unsympathetic directives to each governor. Those chilling words replaced the warmth of his earlier proclamations. Over time, that sorrow smouldered into latent rage. Orders for executions of alleged traitors and arbitrary detentions without trial began to appear. The once handsome, affable emperor of his early reign became an unfamiliar figure, his eyes now harbouring seeds of suspicion and resentment. The Roman Empire, long reliant on justice and mercy, suddenly realized that even its supreme ruler, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, could become the very source of unnameable anguish and unease. Thus begins our story, an emperor bearing loss and duty upon his shoulders, ascending the throne with hopes of preserving peace while carrying the wounds of his own life. As the night deepens, let these reflections on power and loneliness lull you into a dreamscape filled with the echoes of history's contemplations. In the year 26, Anno Domini, Tiberius made a decision that would forever alter the course of his reign. He would leave Rome behind and seek refuge on the island of Capri. This limestone outcrop perched off the Gulf of Naples was rugged and isolated, its steep cliffs and hidden coves, a far cry from the marble splendour of the capital. Officially, he claimed he needed rest, a chance to relieve the burdens of governance. In truth, this retreat marked the birth of a private kingdom, one whose very stones would echo with crimes no history would dare fully recount. Upon his arrival, Tiberius oversaw the construction of 12 sumptuous villas scattered across the island's craggy landscape. Each villa, more like a miniature palace, stood surrounded by olive groves and terraced gardens. Yet concealed within their walls lurked dreadful secrets. Meanwhile, the Senate continued its formal sessions in Rome, issuing decrees and ringing gavel strikes. But the real power now resided on Capri. Through a relentless stream of letters, each sealed with the imperial cipher, Tiberius dispensed life and death. A single missive could carry a death sentence. Silence in response was sometimes as deadly as a blade. Guests summoned to Capri often returned with vacant expressions, haunted by whatever they had witnessed. If they returned at all, their eyes betrayed shock, so profound it silenced their words. Around him, Tiberius assembled a coterie of astrologers, chief among them the sinister Thrasyllus. This dark seer fed the emperor's growing paranoia with dire portents of betrayal, encouraging him to suspect every whisper, every sideways glance, of treason. Under Thrasyllus' influence, Tiberius became convinced that conspiracies lurked in every courtyard and corridor, and that only preemptive terror could secure his throne. Back in Rome, the aristocracy felt the chill of this new regime. Senators, once secure in their titles and privileges, now found themselves trembling at the prospect of a capricious accusation. To survive, they joined a grim network. If you provided victims to appease the emperor's darkest whims, you preserved your estate and possibly acquired greater favour. Thus, political ambition fused with moral degradation, and families once proud of their lineage became complicit in the machinery of horror. The very act of delivering a terrified supplicant, a potential scapegoat to Tiberius's service, was rewarded lavishly, turning cruelty into currency. Paradoxically, Tiberius's physical absence from Rome only magnified his authority. A personal visit might have humanized him. Instead, his ghostly presence in the Senate chambers, felt through cold dispatches, instilled deeper dread. Powerful men learned that the grace or cruelty of this distant ruler hinged on the ink drying on a parchment scroll, where once a sword symbolized imperial might, now a kill carried equal terror. Death by decree proved swifter and subtler than any public execution, and rumor held that some victims perished at home, their final breaths betrayed only by a crumpled seal and an empty chair. Capri thus transformed into a sanctum for Tiberius's darkest impulses. Beyond the manicured gardens and mosaic-tiled baths lay hidden chambers where moral boundaries eroded entirely. Guards patrolled with stern faces, ensuring that none left the villas without explicit permission. Servants moved like shadows, carrying out tasks both menial and monstrous. In the hush of night, faint screams might drift across tiled terraces, but the wind quickly carried them away, leaving no trace but an uneasy silence. Absolute power had twisted Tiberius into a figure of dread rather than respect. No longer merely a ruler operating within the Roman legal framework, he had become a despot whose edicts were writ in blood. Fear reigned supreme, and the promise of imperial favor, however fleeting, made every courtier a willing participant in a macabre theater. Orders to destroy reputations, Zeitzer properties, or eliminate. Rivals arrived wrapped in the same language that once celebrated civic duty. In this new order, privacy was a luxury none could afford, and every action, however innocuous, risked reinterpretation as sedition. And so the island of Capri stood as the epicenter of a regime fueled by dread. There, Tiberius reigned not with the grandeur of a benevolent sovereign, but with the icy hand of a recluse, ensconced in opulence and paranoia. The villas remained silent witnesses to his transformation, their halls echoing with voices that never made it back to Rome. In the stillness of the Mediterranean night, one could almost hear the ghostly scratch of pen on parchment, issuing commands that carved fear into the hearts of all who served and those they betrayed. Tiberius did not stop at wielding political authority. He pursued carnal indulgences, so depraved they defy belief. Ancient chroniclers such as Suetonius and Tacitus record that he summoned children, both boys and girls, to Capri under various pretexts, only to bar their return. These innocents became pawns in his twisted games. Among the most horrifying of his inventions was the practice of minnows, children forced to swim between the emperor's legs in a private pool, caressing, kissing, and stimulating him in grotesque aquatic performances. This was merely the opening act of a depravity that would escalate without restraint. Within the lavish interior of his island villas, Tiberius staged public spectacles of group sexuality known as chains. In these three-person performances, participants, often unwilling or naive youth, were compelled to engage in intercourse while the emperor observed. Such gatherings were presented with an air of theatrical grandeur, complete with draperies, scented oils, and intermittent flute music to heighten the atmosphere. Yet beneath the veneer of erotic spectacle lay a sinister truth. These were not consensual displays of passion, but demonstrations of absolute power exerted over the vulnerable to fuel his ever-deepening appetites. Tiberius amassed a private library of erotic art and literature imported from the eastern provinces. Scrolls and illustrated codices served as manuals for new, more depraved innovations. Some texts described practices so obscure that even learned Romans found no Latin words to capture them. These forbidden guides inspired Tiberius and his retinue to push the boundaries of debauchery further, inventing acts that blurred the line between pleasure and cruelty. Central to this nightmarish enterprise were the spintry-eyed adolescent sex slaves bought or kidnapped from across the empire, then indoctrinated to fulfill the emperor's perversion. These youths lived in isolation, within the villa's hidden quarters, their days consumed by rigorous training in sexual arts, They were taught precise movements, positions, and rituals designed solely for Tiberius's gratification. After serving their master on the emperor's private bed, many spintry met a chilling fate. They were executed to ensure secrecy, or simply eliminated as useless once their purpose was served. Their deaths, whispered in the corridors, served as a grim warning to others who might resist. A network of procurers and power brokers spread throughout Rome and its provinces, scouring towns, ports, and border garrisons for fresh victims. Ambitious senators and wealthy patricians, fearing denunciation as traitors, complied by offering their own relatives, daughters, nieces, even sons to secure their position. Refusal invited false accusations, confiscation of estates, and public disgrace. Thus, Tiberius transformed personal vice into state policy, forging an economy of sexual slavery in which human flesh became a tradable commodity and terror its currency. The mechanics of this system were meticulous. Slave traders catalogued preferred physical types, youth with particular hair color, certain body proportions, and sent carriers laden with human cargo to Capri. Provincial governors, eager to curry imperial favor, compiled lists of prominent families whose children might satisfy the emperor's whims. Roman merchants, once valued for silks and spices, now trafficked in the most unspeakable merchandise. Meanwhile, the treasury swelled with both tribute and bribe, funding the emperor's private enterprises and reinforcing his dominion. Despite the spectacle, most of these horrors remained hidden from public view. Tiberius ensured that any ambassador or senator who dared inquire too deeply vanished without explanation. Rumors spread of secret corridors and concealed doorways within the villas, but no outsider could map the labyrinth of vice. Guards clad in bronze cuirasses and grim visages patrolled the perimeters. Their orders explicit: allow no one to leave with knowledge of what transpired beyond the thresholds. Inside, the routine was both sedate and shocking. Mornings began with muted breakfast conversations, as if nothing sinister occurred the previous night. In the afternoon, Tiberius received reports on provincial uprisings or financial accounts, his expression impassive. Then, at dusk, servants prepared the private chambers for another evening of debauchery. Torches lit corridors scented with myrrh. Dice games and wine flowed freely among courtiers who had grown accustomed to the unnatural, yet laughter there sounded hollow, echoing off marble walls that had witnessed unspeakable acts. Over time, Tiberius's appetite seemed bottomless. Acts once condemned as monstrous became routine requirements for new spintriae. Chains, ceremonies grew wilder, involving more participants and inventive contraptions. Elderly courtiers, once proud of their noble lineage, tempted to outrank each other in procuring young victims, believing this would safeguard their fortunes and lives. The line between criminal conspiracy and erotic performance dissolved entirely under the emperor's gaze. In Rome, the Senate and people heard occasional whispers of the island's terrors, but official records remained silent. Under threat of treason trials, no historian dared to document the full extent of the atrocities. Yet among the common folk, nightmares circulated of infants thrown into hidden cisterns, of noble virgins forced into ritual debasement, of youths driven to madness by the emperor's unnatural demands. Parents warned children to avoid distant aunts or uncles, fearing that invitations to family estates might be a ruse to send them to Capri. Thus, Capri was forever stained as the epicenter of Tiberius's perverse empire, a place where moral constraints evaporated under the heat of imperial caprice. In this realm of unbridled indulgence, Tiberius reigned supreme not only as a political sovereign, but as a master of debasement. His absolute power, once a shield of stability, had become an instrument of systematic cruelty, and though the villas stood gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, their stones absorbed the silent screams of those who never escaped. As night deepens and the stars wheel overhead, We drift through these dark reflections as if on a tranquil sea, lulled by the gentle hum of history's undercurrent. Yet, beneath the calm surface lies a turbulent abyss, one shaped by an emperor's darkest desires and the empire that enabled them. Should we dare venture further into this shadowed chapter? Perhaps, after one more breath, we shall, in the same breath that he indulged his darkest cravings. Tiberius also intensified his political repression by wielding the law against treason. The Maesta's trials, once rare and solemn, became a regular instrument of fear. Prosecutors, judges, and magistrates were transformed into executioners at a whim, ready to condemn anyone whose words, historis, or even a fleeting glance might be construed as disloyal. Under this system, mere suspicion carried the weight of a capital sentence, and no citizen, no matter how distinguished, could be certain of safety. The key architects of this campaign of terror were the delatores, professional informers who thrived on accusations. These men, or sometimes women, spied in corridors, overheard private conversations, and extracted confessions through promises of reward. As they delivered names to the imperial court, their fortunes grew. Confiscated estates and seized properties enriched the delatores and filled the imperial coffers, binding them ever more tightly to Tiberius's autocracy. In the eyes of the people, an accusation was enough to shatter a life. Interrogations became ritualized, spectacles of torture. Prisoners were forced to down vast quantities of wine until staggering drunk, then bound with lute strings around their loins to produce excruciating agony. These coarse cords tightened as the victim's bladder swelled, turning natural functions into instruments of torment. The wounds inflicted were more than physical. They were designed to crush the spirit. A single night under such treatment could break the staunchest patriot into a trembling confession. Even more cruel was the mandate to involve families. Parents of accused children were compelled to witness the torture or execution of their own offspring. Imagine the horror of a father, strong of voice and stature, forced into silent resignation as he watched his child's final moments. And yet, in a perverse display of normalcy, these bereaved parents were then expected to attend imperial banquets, as if the tragedy had never occurred. The uneaten courses and forced smiles spoke volumes of the empire's descent into monstrous absurdity. In those days, the Senate, once the bastion of the Republic's dignity, had been reduced to a chorus of sycophants. Senators competed not to advocate justice, but to propose ever more lavish honours for Tiberius. They vied to be the first to denounce peers, to ensure that mercy never found footing in the imperial court. Personal letters of commendation replaced spirited debate, and the chamber's floor echoed with false praise rather than policy discussion. Rome's grand deliberative body had become a puppet show, its strings held by one man's shadow. Nor did death itself provide escape. If a man died naturally, whether by illness or by his own hand, Tiberius could still charge him posthumously with treason. Confiscating the property of his heirs and dismantling his memory, tombstones were raised, inscriptions erased, as though the dead could be sentenced twice over. In such a world, mourning too visibly became a crime. Children who wept for their parents risked their own lives. The boundary between civic law and personal vendetta vanished, swept away by Tiberius's insatiable hunger for control. Traditional legal safeguards, once held sacred, were perverted beyond recognition. Ancient statutes intended to protect the innocent were resurrected only to justify oppression. A poem critical of the emperor in youth could be cited as treason. A private consultation with a soothsayer about the emperor's health was deemed evidence of conspiracy. Even a coin bearing Tiberius's image dropped in a latrine counted as lese majesty. The letter of the law became the knife with which the emperor carved fear into hearts. In this climate of terror, trust evaporated. Households taught their children to guard their words, to watch every gesture, to speak only when absolutely necessary. Friendships dissolved under suspicion, and even spouses regarded one another warily. as the rumour mills churned. Neighbours accused neighbours in hopes of currying favour or avoiding suspicion themselves. Public gatherings grew sparse, replaced by hushed whispers in starlit courtyards. The social fabric of Rome, once vibrant with debate, camaraderie, and civic pride, lay in tatters. And so Tiberius achieved a reign not by decree alone, but by transforming the empire into a realm of perpetual dread. Through his network of treason trials and delatories, he ensured that every citizen lived under the looming threat of accusation. The line between governance and terror had been erased, replaced by a system where law existed solely to enforce fear. In the stillness of the night, one could almost hear the rustle of scrolls as lists of names were compiled, each promising doom to the next soul, unfortunate enough to appear upon them. The age of Tiberius was an age of silent screams, and Rome's mighty heart beat faintly beneath the weight of its own terror. As the days wore on in Capri, Tiberius's physical form continued its slow, unsettling decline. His once smooth skin became pocked with painful pustules and necrotic scars, reminders of both disease and neglect. Wigs sat crooked atop his bald crown, their heavy fabric slipping intermittently, while layers of thick makeup attempted to mask the ravages upon his face. In these artificial coverings, he hid a body that betrayed the corruption within each inflamed lesion, a testament to the festering darkness of his reign. Night after night, Tiberius slept not in solitude but under a ring of armed guards, their torches flickering against columns that had once symbolized imperial majesty. He insisted that condemned prisoners taste his meals first, a morbid precaution born of chronic fear of poisoning. Each survival was proof of loyalty. Any illness or death among the tasters only deepened his suspicion. In his chambers, pillows bearing the imperial crest were stained with the sweat of terror, and the air held an ever-present tension, as if the walls themselves feared some unseen threat. With the emperor increasingly ensconced in his private nightmares, the heavy burden of civil administration slowly shifted to Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus, at first a loyal lieutenant, flourished under Tiberius's absence. He commanded legions of palace soldiers, attended council meetings in the emperor's stead, and orchestrated the machinery of terror that bound Rome in fear. Together, they formed a sinister partnership, bound by mutual ambition and shared cruelty. Yet in 31 Anno Domini, Tiberius's suspicion turned inward, and Sejanus became his next target. In a dramatic purge, Sejanus and hundreds of those associated with him, soldiers, senators, and even children of the accused, were rounded up, tried in a haze of fear, and executed without mercy. The villas on Capri, once venues for erotic spectacle, became scenes of mass slaughter. The emperor's edicts, carried by trembling couriers, extinguished lives so swiftly that entire families vanished within hours. This violent purge marked the closing chapters of Tiberius's rule, an empire now governed by the grim efficiency of an executioner's blade, rather than the deliberations of the Senate. Yet paradoxically, the foundations of Rome, its traditions of law, its culture of debate, and its civic virtues remained formally intact. Taxes continued to flow into the imperial treasury. Trade fleets still crossed the Mediterranean, laden with grain and olive oil, and foreign envoys accepted Tiberius's decrees in somber protocol. On the surface, the empire functioned, but beneath that facade lay a moral wasteland. By day, the streets of Rome hummed with everyday commerce. Merchants hawked their wares in the forum. Chariot wheels clattered on cobblestones, and plebeians queued at bakeries for their morning loaf. Yet these ordinary scenes played out against an undercurrent of dread. Banquets held by patrician families were hushed affairs. Silken togas rustled in anxious whispers rather than lively conversation. Scholars, once eager to publish treatises on rhetoric or natural philosophy, now hesitated to commit pen to parchment, fearing that a passing line might be deemed seditious. Poets who once celebrated Rome's grandeur abandoned their unfinished verses in dusty scrolls, their quills idle upon marble lecterns. Academics and jurists fled into private studies, cloistering themselves away from prying eyes. No longer did the steps of the Curia echo with spirited debate. Instead, only the faint shuffle of invisible guards could be heard in its vast halls. The weight of silence pressed upon the city like a leaden cloak, and even the laughter of children in narrow alleys carried an edge of fragility. In the grand villas atop the Palatine Hill, noble families withdrew behind high walls. Gardens that once bloomed with roses and violets fell into neglect as their caretakers dared not venture too close to forbidden thresholds. Carriages waited idle in courtyards, their polished wheels unturned. Every household, no matter how exalted, now braced for the possibility of denunciation. A sneeze during dinner could be misheard as mockery, a furtive glance interpreted as disloyalty. Still, life had to go on. The aqueducts continued to channel fresh water, and the amphitheatres filled at dusk for spectacles of lions and gladiators. Even under the pall of terror, the populace sought distraction in ritual and entertainment. Yet these diversions were shadowed by whispers of missing neighbours or rumours of midnight arrests. The grandeur of Rome, its temples, forums, and colonnades cast long shadows over streets, where suspicion lurked behind every pillar. Amid this atmosphere of suffocating panic, the cultural heart of Rome shuddered. Patronage of the arts dried up. No wealthy matron risked hosting a sculptor who might sculpt a statue deemed insufficiently reverent. Philosophical schools closed their doors, their stoic teachings on virtue and courage drowned out by the roar of imperial edicts. The very soul of Roman identity, its belief in justice, civic duty, and the power of reason, crumbled under the relentless assault of fear. Yet even as the empire's spirit withered, the architecture remained a testament to past glory. Marble columns still gleamed in the golden light of dawn. Mosaics depicted scenes of conquest and harmony, but these silent monuments were witnesses to a civilization unraveling from within. The stones held no judgment. They merely reflected the emptiness of a people who had sacrificed their moral core in exchange for survival. As the Levant sun began its slow descent beyond the Tiber's banks, the city braced for another night of quiet terror. Lanterns were lit in windows, their flickering flames a feeble barrier against the darkness. In bedrooms and corridors, Roman citizens, freeborn and freedmen alike, whispered prayers to household gods they scarcely believed in. Sleep came fitfully, as thoughts of disappearances and whispered charges haunted every slumber. And so, the empire once crowned by the auspices of Venus and Mars fell into a sombre lullaby of dread. Where once statues of Julius Caesar inspired awe, now only gibbets and gallows stood as reminders of the price of power unmoored from conscience. In that stillness, the fabric of Rome's great civilization lay torn and tattered, its threads pulled loose by the very emperor sworn to protect them. As night fully takes hold, let us drift into the echo of those final hours, where even the strongest walls could not keep out the creeping chill of desolation. Under Tiberius's reign of terror, the Roman Senate ceased to be a forum of debate and became little more than an instrument of the emperor's will. Senators, once proud guardians of republican tradition, now trembled at every utterance. Free discussion gave way to a race of proposals lauding Tiberius, each crafted to demonstrate loyalty and preserve life and property. Some, unable to bear the shame of being accused, chose to take their own lives. In those final moments, suicide was deemed a merciful act for one's family, safer than a public execution that would strip both honor and inheritance. It was not only the Senate that fell silent. The entire intellectual and artistic class retreated into shadows. Poets released fewer verses, often disguising their true meaning in obscure metaphor to avoid suspicion. Historians hesitated to set pen to parchment, fearful that recounting truth might be read as sedition. The grand libraries of Rome, once bustling with scholars, now stood eerily quiet. Private collections of scrolls and codices gathered dust as their owners feared detection for possessing potentially unpatriotic texts. Philosophers who once held vibrant debates on virtue and duty found themselves avoiding official appointments or public lectures. Physicians, too, retreated from courtly service, wary that a misplaced diagnosis could be construed as an attempt on the emperor's health. Even the schools of rhetoric transformed, rather than teach students the art of persuasion. Instructors focused on the skills of evasion and rationalization, how to speak without meaning, how to flatter without conviction, how to defend oneself against charges never fully specified. Across the empire, a deep anxiety settled into daily life. Noble households whispered behind closed doors, each family member suspecting another of being a potential delator. In the streets, plebeians avoided political topics altogether, preferring to discuss the weather or grain shipments rather than risk a misjudged comment. Officials in provincial towns devoted themselves less to governance and more to currying favor with Tiberius, sending lavish gifts or poisoned rumors north to the Praetorian Guard's ears. Rome's cultural vitality, the spirited dialogues of the forum, the theatrical satire of the stage, the lively exchanges of tavern patrons withered under the weight of constant surveillance. Trust evaporated like morning mist. Public assemblies dwindled until only the most ritualized ceremonies persisted. The price of this outward stability was the destruction of the soul of the city, a society stripped of empathy, debate, and the freedom to think aloud. In this climate of fear, even the simplest human acts carried hidden peril. A father reading a controversial poem to his son might be overheard and accused of inciting rebellion. A mother praising a general's distant victory could be presumed to mock the emperor's own record. The line between loyalty and treason grew so fine that every gesture, every sigh, even a quivering lip, risked interpretation as dissent. Yet, paradoxically, life's basic rhythms continued. Markets opened at dawn. Sewage channels still carried waste away, and the Tiber's waters reflected the morning sun. But beneath this facade of normalcy lay a society hollowed out by paranoia. Children learned to watch their elders' every move, mirroring the cautious silence of their parents. Grandparents, once revered for wisdom, retreated from the hearth, unwilling to share stories that might be construed as politically charged. As the Senate stood broken, its chambers piled high with petitions for imperial praise, the Republic's ideals lay buried beneath layers of fear. The virtue of public service had been exchanged for the virtue of survival, civic duty. Once the guiding principle of Rome's greatness collapsed into self-preservation. In its stead, a new ethos emerged. Serve the emperor first. Protect yourself second, and never speak truth to power. Thus, the very foundation of Roman society crumbled. Citizens no longer argued the merits of policy or philosophy, they negotiated their safety. Intellectuals no longer dared to explore the depths of ethics and governance, they mastered the arts of silence. The Senate, a body that once balanced the power of the consuls, became a rubber stamp for decrees that drained hope from the empire's veins. By the time the sun set each evening, the city lay under a blanket of apprehension. Lanterns glowed in windows, but the light was dimmed by worry. Voices spoke in hushed tones, and laughter, when it occurred, only heightened the sense of its own danger, as if joy might betray an unguarded heart. The price of apparent order was a ruin, far more profound, the ruin of humanity's capacity for trust, for open exchange, and for communal courage. And so, under Tiberius's shadow, Rome transformed from a republic, celebrated for its discourse, into a silent colossus of fear. Its citizens mere figures in a grim tableau where freedom of thought once flourished. Now, only the faintest echo remained, a whisper of what had been lost. As we drift through this history, let us carry the memory of that silence as both warning and lament, an eternal reminder that even the greatest society can be undone when terror drowns out the voice of reason. By the time Tiberius reached his 70th year, his reign of terror had given way to a reign of terror-driven paranoia, and his mind became a labyrinth of fears and omens. Each morning, he consulted the stars, poring over charts inked on parchment, as if the movement of distant planets could reveal the whereabouts of traitors. His chief astrologer, Thrasyllus, occupied a place of great influence, interpreting every celestial twitch, every eclipse, every passing comet as a sign of conspiracy. In the imperial chamber, Tiberius would stare at the night sky's representations long after candles guttered, seeking comfort in patterns that only deepened his dread. No precaution seemed excessive. Guards stationed at the entrance to his private retreat were ordered to taste his food first, a practice so contrary to tradition that Augustus himself had never permitted it. Yet Tiberius insisted, convinced that poison stalked every banquet. If a taster showed even the slightest sign of distress, the cook was executed on the spot. In this way, the routine of dining became a gauntlet of suspicion. Each crumb of bread or sip of wine, a potential threat. By night, he slept in a heavily guarded chamber, walls lined with armed praetorians, whose armor clinked softly as they shifted watch. Every shadow held a possible assassin. Every creak suggested a blade sliding free. He awoke frequently, chest heaving at imagined footsteps, startled by the subtlest disturbance, a distant cough in the corridor, the rustle of leaves beyond the window. Sleep offered no refuge, only fleeting moments between dread-soaked awakenings. Meanwhile, in Rome, real power continued to pass from hand to hand. After the purge of Sejanus, Tiberius had entrusted much of the day-to-day governance to successive prefects of the guard. Yet, though he remained physically distant, his fearsome reputation echoed through the streets and forums. Statues and reliefs in the capital portrayed a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and hollow eyes, crowned by a precarious wig and slathered in thick makeup. This mask of artifice became an emblem of his moral decay, the emperor who could not trust even his own face. As the final months of his life unfolded, Tiberius's obsession with mortality intensified. He consulted soothsayers at dawn, at noon, at dusk, seeking reassurance that the hour of his demise had not yet arrived. He carried small charms, amulets shaped like Herculean knots or crocodile teeth tucked beneath his tunic. Each tiny object offered a momentary warding off of death's chill breath, though none truly stilled the torment in his mind. On the 16th day of March in the year 37, Anno Domini, Tiberius, Caesar Augustus, breathed his last at the age of 77. Some whispered that Sejanus, in a final act of vengeance, had quietly strangled the emperor in his bedchamber. Official records, however, attributed his passing to natural causes, disease, and the weariness of years spent under relentless fear. In the stillness that followed, Rome's populace erupted in jubilation. From the Capitoline to the far reaches of the provinces, crowds echoed the cry that had grown familiar during his reign. Cast his body into the river, a chant of relief and loathing intertwined. The Senate, once cowed into silence, initially refused the customary deification. Statues lay unadorned. Altars remained unlit. Only under the gentle insistence of his nephew and successor, Caligula, did they finally grant the hollow honours due an emperor. Yet even as incense burned and lictors marched, the ceremony felt perfunctory, a pale echo of genuine reverence. And so ended the life of Tiberius, a ruler who had once prided himself on restraint and duty, only to become consumed by dread and cruelty. As darkness settled over the city on that final night, the Romans laid down to sleep with a collective exhale, their nightmares less haunted by the emperor's spectre and more by the memories of all they had endured. As dawn's pale light brushed the marble pillars of Rome in the wake of Tiberius's demise, A new chapter of reflection began. Historians and scholars gathered in quiet libraries and dusty lecture halls, teacups in hand, to debate the veracity of the chilling accounts that survived. Two names rose above the rest in these somber conversations: Publius Cornelius Tacitus and Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Tacitus, with his measured prose and penchant for moral inquiry, aimed to interrogate the motives of power. Suetonius, ever attentive to scandal and vivid detail. The recorded scenes so grotesque that centuries later they still sent a shiver down the spine. Tacitus wrote of Tiberius with a voice that trembled between disgust and dismay. He detailed trials twisted into spectacles of cruelty, and he lamented the corruption of the Senate under a ruler who loved justice only when it served his own fears. Suetonius, drawing from imperially guarded archives and eyewitness whispers, painted vivid tableaux, private pools turned into settings for unspeakable games, villas, hiding chambers of torment, and the emperor's nightly feasts, shadowed by the spectre of poison. Neither chronicler obscured their revulsion, neither flinched at the gruesome, yet even they acknowledged their potential bias. Tacitus for his senatorial sympathies, Suetonius for his taste for the sensational. In modern times, some revisionist scholars have argued these sources may exaggerate. They suggest that under Caligula's chaotic years, scribes and rhetoricians amplified Tiberius's faults to make his successor appear less monstrous. They note the scarcity of archaeological evidence for specific atrocities and caution that rumor often accrues layers of horror over time. Yet when one surveys the surviving testimonies, from exiled senators' letters to graffiti defaming the emperor, one finds threads of consistency across disparate provinces and generations of writers. The portrait of terror remains strikingly uniform, hinting at a core of grim reality beneath the rhetorical flourish. Scholars often invoke Lord Acton's famous dictum, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." In Tiberius's case, a confluence of factors magnified that dynamic. First, there were the personal tragedies, the early losses, the forced political marriages, the death of his son, wounds that shaped a man predisposed to suspicion and bitterness. Second, the relentless pressures of rule-managing legions, balancing senatorial pride and safeguarding an empire must have weighed heavily on any mortal mind. Third, Tiberius had at his disposal the apparatus of law itself, enabling him to redefine treason at will and subordinate justice to fear. And finally, the very ethos of the Julio-Claudian court, accustomed to intrigues, patronage, and the procurement of human gifts, provided fertile soil for vice to flourish. Yet the historian's questions extend beyond, was Tiberius truly that vile? They probe deeper. How did Roman society endure 2 decades and more of such terror? The answer lies in the interplay of fear and habit. Over time, what begins as a shocking innovation becomes, through repetition and indifference, part of the social fabric. Judges accustomed to condemning neighbors for the merest hint of dissent grew bolder. Informers learned that denunciation was more profitable than honest service. Families, once unified by shared values, found themselves fractured by suspicion. A child's sobs behind closed doors signaled danger. But silence prevailed, for speech could be fatal. Public rituals also helped normalize the unnatural. The daily forum sessions progressed without interruption. Temple offerings continued. Festivals honored the gods even as their devotees quailed. In a sense, the empire's mechanical rhythms, tax collection, grain distribution, legal hearings offered psychological shelter. Citizens learned that if they performed their civic duties dutifully, they might pass under the radar of imperial wrath. This partial compliance, coupled with the occasional offer of fealty, an elaborate banquet here, a public dedication there, satisfied the emperor's cravings for both tribute and humiliation of his subjects. Politically, The debasement of republican institutions under Tiberius created precedents that echoed for generations. The expansion of treason trials continued under later emperors. The delatore system persisted as a means for ambitious courtiers to curry favor. Even benevolent rulers found themselves constrained by the machinery of terror they inherited. The Senate, once broken, never fully reclaimed its old authority. It remained an echo chamber for imperial edicts rather than a check on power. Yet alongside this legacy of fear, some silver threads of reflection emerge. Roman thinkers began to ponder the moral limits of authority. Stoic philosophers, though driven underground, wrote new treatises on inner virtue that contrasted sharply with the spectacle of cruelty. Mystery religions from the East, offering promises of justice beyond the grave, found fresh converts among those disillusioned by earthly despotism. And in the silent alchemy of memory, the stories of Tiberius's victims became talismans of warning against unchecked rule. Thus, historians grapple with a dual legacy. On one hand, the stark lesson of how power can warp both ruler and ruled. On the other, the emergence of moral philosophies and spiritual movements born of suffering. Modern scholars continue to sift through scrolls and shards, trying to balance outrage at the inhumanity with a sober appraisal of Rome's resilience. As our eyelids droop and the night deepens, imagine yourself flipping through dusty pages of an ancient codex. The lamp's flame dancing across Latin, words that speak of fear, corruption, and sorrow. In that quiet moment, the historian's task feels almost sacred to bear witness to the past's darkest chapters, so that future generations might guard their hearts and their institutions against the slow creep of tyranny. The empire that once spanned 3 continents may have crumbled into ruin, but the stories of its fall remain, whispering warnings across millennia. May we listen, even as sleep beckons, to the echoes of those distant voices. And may we learn from their terrors before we too drift into darkness. Despite the terror that gripped Rome, the empire's economy remained curiously resilient. Tax collectors continued their rounds without pause, and the aqueducts and roads received just enough maintenance to keep grain moving into the city and water flowing into the lofty baths. Yet beneath this veneer of stability lay a costly diversion of resources. Vast sums that might once have funded public works, new temples, bridges, or marketplaces were instead consumed by an expanded network of imperial procurers and praetorian guards. Funds were channeled into securing fresh human cargo for the emperor's pleasures, maintaining stations of informers, and bribing officials whose loyalties were all but guaranteed by gilded gifts. Large landowners, ever mindful of the emperor's capricious wrath, either hid their wealth in secret vaults or donated generously to public spectacles and religious dedications. These acts, intended to display loyalty, paradoxically drained long-term capital from ventures that would have spurred growth. Shipbuilders found fewer contracts, merchants secured fewer trading posts, and artisan guilds saw diminished patronage. As a result, while income trickled into the treasury, investment in new industries dwindled. Rome's economic engine hummed on, but the promise of expansion and innovation slowed to a mere whisper. In the realm of culture and scholarship, the toll was even more profound. Esteemed writers turned their pens toward the mythic past, crafting epic poems about heroes long dead or philosophical treatises on bygone republics. References to current affairs, once a staple of literary discourse, became taboo. Poets filled their verses with layered metaphors that only the most discerning reader could decode, lest any explicit commentary risk condemnation. Libraries that once buzzed with debates on ethics, law, and science felt deserted. As scholars feared, their notes might be seized as evidence of disloyalty. Amid the hushed corridors of academies, Stoicism found renewed relevance. Its teachings on inner tranquility, in the face of external chaos, offered a haven for minds battered by fear. Philosophers preached that true freedom resided not in the halls of power, but in the sovereignty of one's reason. Small gatherings of disciples discussed the works of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, seeking solace in the notion that virtue could outlast tyranny. Though these sessions carried the risk of surveillance, participants believed the spiritual refuge was worth the danger. Simultaneously, mystery religions from the eastern provinces gained momentum. Cults dedicated to deities like Isis and Mithras promised a transcendent salvation, a personal connection to the divine that stood apart from mortal cruelty. Initiates whispered of secret rites performed in candlelit chambers, of fellowship that transcended social rank, and of an afterlife unmarred by the emperor's vendettas. For many Romans, these faiths became lifelines, an assurance that true justice and mercy awaited beyond the suffering of this world. Over time, the combination of stoic introspection and mystical hope created a subtle cultural revival. Ideas suppressed under Tiberius began to resurface not in public forums, but in private conversation. Pamphlets circulated clandestinely, passing from hand to hand, reintroducing critical dialogue on governance and ethics. Although it would take decades for these currents to shape policy again, the embers of intellectual freedom glowed once more. Under subsequent emperor, the long road to recovery commenced. Public projects resumed in earnest. Aqueduct repairs were followed by grand bathhouses. Road improvements gave way to new trade routes. Temples rose again with reliefs celebrating civic pride rather than imperial terror. Patrons reopened their scroll boxes, commissioning histories and plays that cautiously addressed the past 2 decades. The Senate, though never fully restored to its republican glory, regained some dignity as emperors allowed greater debate and reduced the scope of treason prosecutions. Nevertheless, the legacy of Tiberius's reign lingered. Legal precedents for expansive definitions of treason persisted, and the delatores system, though reformed, remained a cautionary tale of how easily justice could be weaponized. Generations of elite families bore scars from forfeited estates and shattered reputations, affecting societal structures far beyond the imperial palace. The collective memory of fear became woven into Rome's identity, shaping a cautious pragmatism that balanced awe of power with an acute awareness of its potential for abuse. In the quiet twilight of empire, as the Mediterranean breeze stirred the cypresses that lined the ancient roads, Romans carried forward lessons born of suffering. They rebuilt monuments not only to their victories but to their resilience. They wrote histories that acknowledged both the heights of imperial grandeur and the depths of human frailty. And in their schools, they taught young minds to value critical thought, personal integrity, and the courage to speak truth to power, ensuring that the echo of Tiberius's darkness might one day become a distant hum beneath the chorus of Rome's enduring spirit. The tale of Tiberius stands as a warning that echoes across the centuries when power goes unchecked. Political machinery becomes vulnerable to the whims of personal desire. An empire once renowned for its law and order descended into madness, as statutes were twisted to satisfy lust and vengeance. The very edicts meant to protect citizens became instruments of cruelty, and the architect of this perversion was none other than the emperor himself. From this dark chapter, history offers clear lessons. First and foremost, the necessity of checks and balances cannot be overstated. When legislative bodies cede authority or become mere rubber stamps for executive fiat, tyranny finds fertile ground. The Roman Senate under Tiberius lost its deliberative purpose and became a tool for executing the emperor's will. In contrast, a healthy polity requires that no single office hold absolute sway. Shared power between executive, legislative, and judicial branches creates friction that resists the slide into autocracy. Equally vital is the protection of individual rights. Under Tiberius's reign, the concept of due process collapsed. Accusations of treason led swiftly to confiscation of property and execution. Often without fair trial or impartial adjudication, modern societies must ensure that legal protections, presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, transparent procedures are enshrined and sacrosanct. Only when citizens trust that the law serves justice rather than fear can the social contract endure. Transparency in governance emerges as another key safeguard. Tiberius shrouded his actions in secrecy, ruling from a distant island and dispensing life and death sentences through curt, sealed letters. This opacity fed paranoia on both sides of power. When rulers hide their decisions behind closed doors, speculation and suspicion breed, eroding public confidence. By contrast, open deliberation, public records of proceedings, freely accessible laws, and accountable decision-making prevents abuses and reassures citizens that their welfare, not a ruler's whims, guide policy. The story also underscores the perils of conflating public office with private interest. Tiberius weaponized law to exact personal revenge and to indulge his darkest impulses. He blurred the line between private vice and public policy until governance itself became an instrument of perversion. In any era, when leaders exploit official powers for personal gain, whether financial, sexual, or ideological, they undermine the very principles that hold societies together: ethical standards, strict prohibitions against conflicts of interest, and independent oversight bodies help maintain that crucial boundary between the personal and the political imperative. Moreover, the Romans' willingness to rationalize cruelty serves as a caution. Under Tiberius, informers, procurers, and even senators justified participation in atrocities as necessary for survival. This normalization of evil, step by step, made monstrous acts appear routine. Modern societies must remain vigilant against incremental erosions of morality when small concessions today pave the way for greater transgressions tomorrow. Strong civic virtues, education in critical thinking, and a culture of moral courage are essential to resist the slippery slope from compromise to complicity. The psychological dimension of Tiberius's reign reminds us of the human cost of unchecked authority. Fear silenced voices, suspicion destroyed relationships, and trauma seeped into every household. In the aftermath, even when more benevolent rulers held power, Rome's social fabric took generations to heal. Today, leaders should recognize the long-term damage wrought by policies of intimidation and oppression. Societies scarred by state terror require not only political reform but also healing truth commissions, memorialization of victims, and support for collective recovery. Finally, the enduring relevance of Tiberius's story lies in its demonstration of how systemic corruption can permeate every level of society. When an emperor led by example in betrayal and exploitation, courtiers, soldiers, merchants, and even priests found ways to profit or protect themselves by echoing his misconduct. This teaches that combating corruption demands more than prosecuting high-profile malefactors. It requires cultivating cultures of integrity at every stratum, whistleblower protections, transparent financial disclosures, and robust anti-corruption agencies help deter the spread of venality. As our thoughts grow drowsy and the night's quiet envelops us, let the fate of Rome under Tiberius serve as a lullaby that warns rather than comforts. It reminds us that vigilance is the price of liberty, and that institutional design, legal safeguards, and ethical leadership form the bulwarks against despotism. Though history's darkest reigns can befall any era, it is in our power to learn, to erect structures that limit ambition, and to foster a civic spirit that places justice above fear. May these lessons linger in the half-light of your mind, guiding you toward a dawn where governance honors both law and conscience. Beneath the moonlit shadows of Capri's ancient pines, a darker tragedy unfolded, one that ensnared women and children in a web of fear and cruelty. Under Tiberius's rule, from noble women draped in silken stolas to peasant girls gathering olives on sun-baked slopes, no female life remained untouched by the emperor's tyranny. Mothers of the highest birthright found themselves stripped of agency, coerced into wedding alliances meant to secure imperial favor. Promises of wealth and status gave way to silent tears when their daughters were escorted away at dawn, never to return home. Should these young women survive their service to the emperor, they were whispered to vanish into the mists of the island, eliminated without trial, so that the secrets of Capri remained buried. It was a grotesque reversal of every maternal instinct, where once a mother might have shielded her child. Now she became a bargaining chip. Noble households, once proud of their lineage, weighed the cost of resistance against the safety of silence. To refuse the emperor's demand was to invite ruin, confiscated estates, accusation of treason, or worse, death by decree. And so they complied, their hearts cloaked in sorrow, their public faces composed, while in private chambers they mourned futures, stolen as cruelly as Lucius falling prey to a noose. Yet it was the youngest victims whose suffering eclipsed all else. The spintry, adolescent sex slaves, trafficked from every province, bore the brunt of Tiberius's perverse creativity, torn from their families in the dead of night. They arrived on Capri, bewildered and afraid. Guards in polished armor guided them through ornate halls, past mosaics depicting mythic triumphs, until they reached hidden chambers, where the emperor's instructions awaited. There, under pale torchlight, instructors taught them movements borrowed from exotic dances, contorted postures meant to titillate the ailing ruler and all before they truly understood what was demanded. For some, the ordeal began in the emperor's private pool, branded by the court as minnows. These children were ordered to swim between the emperor's legs, stroking and caressing in a grotesque aquatic ballet. The water, once a source of life and refreshment, became a stage for humiliation. Others faced the theatre of the chains, where groups of 3 were forced into public displays of intercourse before an audience of courtiers, musicians, and the emperor's paling face. These scenes, recorded in fragments by historians brave enough to speak, testified to a depravity that blurred every line of decency. Exhaustion claimed many spintry before the emperor's night ended. Some collapsed from thirst and overexertion, their bodies limp upon marble steps. Others fell ill from unsanitary conditions in hidden dormitories, where illness spread unchecked, and no physician dared offer aid without risking suspicion. And when the living became little more than burdensome records, they were dispatched silently, some flung from craggy cliffs, others poisoned in their beds, still more strangled to prevent any final cries. Their names disappeared from court rolls, their faces vanished from memory, leaving only empty niches in villa walls. Those who survived, rare as they were, carried indelible scars, haunted by nightmares of slick stones and whispered commands. They learned to walk corridors with bowed heads, eyes fixed on the ground to escape the gaze of patrolling guards. Privacy proved impossible. Every door had eyes behind the keyhole. Every corridor carried the echo of approaching sandals. Escape was a luxury none could afford, for the very act of flight branded one as guilty of treason, an unforgivable offence. And so the families of these spintrii, whether noble or humble, lived in mute horror. Mothers rocked empty cradles. Fathers traded grain in markets with faces ashen, each fearing a knock upon the door. Neighbours whispered condolences, but no hand reached out to comfort, for sympathy itself risked implication. The voice that might have cried out in protest stayed locked behind trembling lips, weighed down by the knowledge that speaking could invite ruin. Roman law, once a proud instrument of justice, morphed into a tool of oppression. Statutes were rewritten to require unyielding loyalty to the emperor. Any hint of dissent and overheard conversation lamenting the fates of these victims. A charcoal sketch capturing the anguish of a pale-faced girl invited accusations of sedition. Judges, once arbiters of fair trial, now served as executioners at the emperor's whim. The concept of sanctuary vanished. No temple door offered protection. No plea for clemency found purchase in the emperor's heart. In this twisted reality, even children learned early the price of defiance. In the narrow alleys of Rome, whispers of the island's horrors spread as cautionary tales. Parents admonished toddlers to speak only when spoken to avoid drawing attention like moths to a deadly flame. Educators in hidden corners taught coded lessons on nuance and illusion, lest a frank question in class be reported by a zealous observer. And so innocence, once the province of youth, was smothered under an ever-present dread. What endures, beyond the crumbling villas and the silenced scrolls, is the memory of voices that never rose against the tide. Women and children, powerless beneath the weight of imperial mandate, became symbols of a society that traded compassion for compliance. As the empire laboured onward, collecting taxes and maintaining walls, the true cost lay buried beneath waves and tiles, in the unmarked graves of those who vanished without trace. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the hush of history cradle your mind, and let the fates of these innocents serve as a gentle alarm. Remember that no society can stand when its weakest are sacrificed to the whims of the powerful, and may this stirring of sorrow in your heart ensure that, in your own world, the vulnerable find shelter, not silence, under the watch of compassion rather than fear. Under the velvet cloak of Capri's night sky, Tiberius's cruelty to flesh found its counterpart in a sacrilege of the spirit. His villas, once places of Roman refinement, became stages for profane mockeries of sacred rites. Priests, summoned to perform sacrifices to Jupiter or Mars, instead found themselves compelled to enact obscene parodies. The altars, heavy with blood of oxen and goats, were repurposed for senseless debauchery. Ritual purity gave way to ritual desecration. As incense burned, the gods themselves seemed to recoil from such twisted ceremonies, their divine favour slipping through the fingers of a populace forced to witness impiety in the name of power. Roman temples, symbols of civic piety, grew eerily silent. Vestal virgins, guardians of the eternal flame, were summoned from their sacred service to attend imperial feasts. Yet instead of safeguarding hearth and home, they watched in stoic horror as rituals lost their meaning. In some accounts, fire danced on their robes not in reverence but in warning, as if the very flame foretold the empire's moral conflagration. When earthquakes shook the foundations of Rome, or floods gushed through its streets, many whispered that the gods expressed their wrath. Fires, whether in the Forum or along the Tiber, were seen as divine signs of indignation at the emperor's blasphemies. Amidst this sacrificial upheaval, the old civic cults sagged under the weight of disillusionment. Citizens who once took pride in daily offerings to household deities felt the rituals had lost their power. The lares and penates, spirits of hearth and pantry, could not shield families from the arbitrary violence of treason trials. Prayer fell on deaf ears when the law itself seemed an agent of terror. Gradually, worship moved underground, safe only in whispered prayers behind closed doors, where tiny shrines to old gods stood hidden beneath floorboards or tucked behind loose stones in garden walls. Seeking solace, many Romans turned their gaze eastward. Mystery cults, once fringe corners of spiritual life, flourished in covert gatherings. In lamplit catacombs beneath the city, initiates of Isis shared a ritual meal symbolizing rebirth. In hidden Mithraeums carved into hillsides, devotees of Mithras enacted ceremonies promising salvation through shared suffering. These faiths offered more than theological nuance. They provided a community whose bonds transcended imperial fear. Here was a promise that death did not end one's journey, that cosmic justice reigned where earthly justice had fled. For a populace besieged by arbitrary decrees, such assurances carried an almost magnetic pull. Yet not all turned to hopeful mystery. A gloom settled over some hearts, a pervasive cynicism that defeated both civic and spiritual trust. To them, neither gods nor men held to any higher principle if Jupiter could not protect the faithful, and if emperors desecrated what was sacred, then perhaps all was for naught. Philosophical pessimism edged forward, as thinkers pondered whether virtue had any place in a world so bent on cruelty. In secluded gardens along the Appian Way, Scholars debated the futility of ethics under tyranny, even as the owls hooted in the night. Unmoved by human despair, amid zur spiritual Unrest, nascent movements found fertile ground. Prophets of simple life, followers of a proto-Taoist creed that had drifted westward, preached harmony with nature, detachment from material excess, and trust in an inner moral compass rather than capricious rulers. They gathered at dawn by quiet streams, glancing warily at passing patrols, yet committed to living austerely. While their numbers remained small, their message spread when official cults fail. The simplest truths endure. Most poignant of all was the early stirrings of what would become Christianity. Word of a carpenter's son who healed the sick and embraced the outcast spread quietly among the downtrodden. His teachings, equality of souls, love of neighbour, and a kingdom not of this world, resonated with those who had seen power perverted beyond recognition. In secret chambers, new believers broke bread in remembrance, whispering prayers that gave voice to hope rather than fear. Though historians debate the precise timeline, the moral clarity of this emerging faith offered a stark contrast to the emperor's moral chaos. In the twilight between old gods and new, Rome's spiritual tapestry frayed and rewove itself. The grand civic festivals survived in form, but their substance eroded. Temples reopened their doors, yet few entered with genuine devotion. In households where once the Lares presided over hearth and health, simple crucifixes or Eastern talismans took their place. Some families retained ancestral rites in private, even as they lit candles to foreign saints. The confluence of Stoic inwardness, Eastern mystery, and proto-Christian compassion promised a mosaic of belief that outlasted Tiberius's tyranny. As midnight deepened and the lanterns guttered in distant streets, the echo of sacred hymns and quiet chants drifted through Rome's silent corridors. In these hushed moments, the empire's spiritual life found new pathways. Though scarred by violent mockery and terror, the Roman soul began its slow resurrection, not in grand temples, but in hidden hearts. And as you drift closer to sleep, let these whispers of faith serve as a gentle reminder, even when power corrupts every worldly institution. The human spirit seeks and often finds its sanctuary beyond the reach of tyrants. As the moon drifts low over the Mediterranean, we turn our weary gaze to the quivering pages of history, seeking to compare Tiberius's dark reign with those of other emperors who flirted with cruelty and excess. Few rulers before or since have melded political repression and sexual depravity so thoroughly. Consider Nero, whose stagecraft and private debaucheries earned him infamy. His capricious whims inspired rumours of lewd theatre and even murder for pleasure. Yet Nero's excesses remained largely personal. He did not embed his perversions into the very fabric of the state like Tiberius did. Then there was Caligula, whose brief tenure borrowed from Tiberius's cruelty but lacked systematic implementation. Caligula's whims declaring war on Neptune, demanding to be worshipped as a god, and reportedly indulging in bizarre sexual spectacles sent shivers through the Senate. Yet his reign spanned mere years, and his actions, while shocking, were disjointed and erratic rather than methodically woven into law and policy. Where Caligula's reign collapsed into chaos, Tiberius's rule operated with grim efficiency, using the machinery of state to sustain an empire-wide terror that reached into homes, temples, and even the sacred poolside rituals at Capri. From these comparisons emerge three enduring political lessons, each as crucial as the next one. Mechanisms of power control. Tiberius's reign confirms the imperative of separation of powers. In the Roman system, the Senate, magistracies, and armies once balanced one another. Under Tiberius, those checks eroded. The emperor alone could indict, imprison, and execute without restraint. To prevent such concentration of authority, modern governments distribute power among independent branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. Each branch monitors and limits the others, so that no single individual or faction can dominate, even in times of crisis. Preserving these boundaries safeguards against the slide into autocracy. 2. Protection of human rights. The horrors unleashed under Tiberius's hand demonstrate why unalienable rights must bind every ruler. When laws cater exclusively to the whims of the powerful, they cease to protect citizens. Tiberius manipulated treason statutes and weaponized informers against anyone who displeased him. Today, constitutions and international charters enshrine due process, freedom of speech, and protection against cruel punishment. Crucially, mechanisms for lodging complaints, ombudsman, independent courts, transparent investigations must remain free from political meddling. Only then can the law serve justice rather than vengeance. 3. Common moral values. Finally, Tiberius's tyranny teaches us that societies rest on shared ethical foundations. When civic virtue decays, when education ignores the cultivation of courage and empathy, citizens become prone to complicity in crimes against humanity. Under Tiberius, the thirst for self-preservation drove men to betray neighbors and even family. A robust civil society counters that impulse. Schools, media, and community organizations must champion virtues, honesty, solidarity, responsibility. When citizens learn to cherish fairness over fear, public institutions reflect those values, making it harder for corruption and oppression to take root. To feel these lessons more keenly, imagine the gentle hush of a library at midnight. Scrolls of ancient wisdom, glowing faintly in torchlight. There lies the cautionary tale of Tiberius's unchecked power and the promise that, through carefully designed institutions and a culture of moral courage, we can guard against the darkness he embraced. Let these reflections, drifting through your mind like a whispering breeze, remind you that vigilance, rights, and shared values form the trinity that preserves freedom in any era. As dawn broke over the Palatine Hill, Rome stirred once more beneath the weight of history's turning pages. Tiberius's shadow lingered long after his final breath. Though the empire endured, its scars remained etched into every marble pillar and dusty ledger. The Senate, pried from the emperor's iron grip, discovered that its voice had grown hoarse. Once a forum of robust debate, it now resembled an infirm council hall, where cautious nods replaced eloquent speeches and the rustle of togas betrayed a lingering caution. Political cleanliness, so essential to public trust, had been tarnished, and no amount of legislative scrubbing could fully restore its sheen. Among the noble families, the very concept of honor seemed fragile. Matrons who once hosted lavish banquets now met in hushed salons, the wary of any remark that might echo too closely to Tiberius's old accusations. Estates that had provided generations of wealth lay under secretive accounting, their owners preferring private ledgers to public declarations. The aristocracy, long accustomed to privilege, found its confidence shaken. Would the next emperor reign justly, or would he revive old precedents of vendetta and intrigue? Such questions lingered in every whispered conversation. Meanwhile, in the streets and marketplaces, common citizens previously lulled into a wary acceptance began to reclaim a sense of agency. Tax collectors no longer demanded bribes with the threat of treason trials. Merchants reopened their stalls without furtive glances toward patrolling guards. Yet, as life edged toward normalcy, the memory of Tiberius's terror remained a ghost at Rome's banquet table. Parents still cautioned their children about the harm of drawing undue attention, a habit born of necessity under darker days. Successive emperors, Caligula's brief madness, Claudius's hesitant reforms, Nero's theatrical cruelty, and Vespasian's attempts at stability all inherited the legacy forged on Capri. Each ruler grappled with the arsenal of laws and customs Tiberius had unleashed, The expansive definition of treason he established persisted in dusty legal codes, ready for revival at a moment's notice. The network of informers, once the lifeblood of imperial vigilance, continued in diminished form, cautioning that the machinery of persecution required only a single crank to resume full operation. Even when emperors sought to roll back Tiberius's worst excesses, they found themselves constrained by the precedents he set and the culture of fear he nurtured. Yet, in the crucible of adversity, Rome also forged tools of reform. Inspired by the wounds inflicted during Tiberius's reign, jurists and lawmakers embarked on projects to codify what came to be known as the imperial law, a framework intended to balance the emperor's authority with safeguards for citizen rights. Under this budding legal structure, the power to prosecute treason was circumscribed by clearer definitions and procedural requirements. Citizens gained limited rights to appeal provincial verdicts. Commissioners were appointed to oversee confiscated lands, ensuring revenues served public works rather than private fiefdoms. These measures could not erase the past, but they laid foundations for a more transparent governance. The cultural legacy also evolved. Philosophers and theologians who had once dabbled in trepidation now spoke with new boldness. In lecture halls, Stoic teachers extolled the virtues of inner resilience and civic duty. Mystery cults, which had offered solace during the darkest nights, found themselves sharing platforms with emerging Christian communities. Each belief system contributed to a richer tapestry of Roman spirituality, weaving lessons of compassion and accountability into the fabric of public life. Over decades, as Christian bishops acquired influence and the old pagan institutions gradually yielded to new faiths, the memory of Tiberius served as a cautionary tale. Sermons spoke of moral corruption, drawing parallels between tyrannical vice and the promise of redemption through Christ. The very bones of the empire, its laws, its customs, its moral compass, shifted under the impetus of these spiritual currents. What had begun as a desperate refuge in the face of imperial cruelty blossomed into a movement championing the inherent dignity of every soul. By the time the ancient republic's ideals rekindled under the Enlightenment of later centuries, long after Rome's stones had crumbled into dust, the story of Tiberius remained a ghost story told by candlelight. Scholars labored over fragmentary records. Seeking the truth amid rumor and propaganda, they pieced together accounts that ranged from the absurd to the horrific, striving to separate the man from the myth. Through their efforts, Tiberius's legacy transformed from mere legend into a profound study in the potential for human governance to veer toward monstrosity when unchecked. And yet, for all the reforms, for all the spiritual awakenings, the empire never fully shed its darkest shadow. Legal scholars still debated the proper balance of executive power. Philosophers still warned of the ease with which a once stable society could slip into fear. The echoes of Tiberius's reign served as an ever-present reminder: no generation could afford complacency. The structures built to prevent tyranny required constant tending, and the moral vigilance of citizens stood as the final bulwark against the return of despotism. So, as you drift towards sleep under the vast dome of history, let the legacy of recovery and reform resonate softly in your mind. Remember how Rome, scarred by brutal excess, chose to rebuild, to enshrine limits on power, to revive compassion in faith, to guard the delicate balance between authority and liberty. In that delicate balance lies the enduring promise that even the deepest wounds of tyranny can spur a renaissance of justice, provided we honor the lessons taught by the ghosts of Capri and the steadfast march of human resilience. As our gentle journey through the shadows of Tiberius's reign draws to a close, let us drift momentarily on the soft waves of reflection. This story, dark as it may be, offers us more than mere fascination with cruelty. It grants a mirror in which we might survey the fragile interplay between power and morality. From the secluded villas of Capri to the silent corridors of Rome's Senate, we have seen how unchecked authority can corrode both law and compassion, leaving behind an empire built on fear rather than shared values. Through this video, We learn that the most enduring lesson is the necessity of balance between governing and serving, between public duty and private desire, between the might of the state and the rights of individuals. Tiberius's descent into terror reminds us that even the most stable institutions can crumble when concentrated in a single will. His legacy teaches that democracies and republics alike must cultivate robust mechanisms, separation of powers, transparent justice, and civic education to guard against the seduction of absolute rule. We also discover the vital importance of moral courage in the hush of history's darkest chapters. The few who whispered against injustice or sheltered the vulnerable became beacons of resistance. Their quête de défiance, though often forced underground, planted seeds of recovery that one day blossomed into reforms and spiritual renewal. From the Stoic philosophers who championed inner virtue to the earliest believers in a more compassionate faith, these voices remind us that resilience and hope persist even in the aftermath of terror. Moreover, Tiberius's story underscores the value of collective vigilance. When families, neighbors, and institutions fall silent, cruelty advances unchallenged. Yet when communities insist on openness, accountability, and empathy, they build a fortress against tyranny. It is this shared commitment to justice and dignity that ensures no leader, however powerful, can so easily warp the course of society. As you settle into the comfort of your own evening, let the echoes of Rome's trials linger like a lullaby with a moral refrain. May you carry forward the understanding that power, if unmoored from conscience, sows only despair. But when grounded in empathy and governed by law, it becomes the hand that protects and uplifts. So whisper a silent promise to yourself to value balance, to speak with courage, and to cherish the fragile alliance between freedom and responsibility. In that promise lies the true legacy of Tiberius's tale, and the enduring hope that history's darkest shadows can guide us toward a brighter dawn.